seems like it was a sort of an intellectual exercise and kind of an abstract topic, but it was actually very personal to me because I grew up in a very academic family. My father's a scientist, my stepfather was a scientist, my mother's an academic, and I was taught a very specific mindset towards concepts like intuition. Certainly concepts like telepathy or synchronicity were just something that I was taught that wasn't real, that just didn't exist. But I came forward feeling like a very intuitive person. That's just how I was. I always loved the arts. I felt like I was always guided more intuitively. That's just who I was. So, but I was taught that that's not real. So that's sort of a strange, almost existential thing. But who I am, it's not right or it's not real, and I felt like I had to prove it. And then as I grew up, you know, I found that I didn't need my family to give me that feedback. Somewhere I had that in myself. So there'd be a lot of disclaimers, a lot of, well, I felt this, but I mean, I try to always explain it through science. So it's like there was a battle within me, and that's how I approached this thesis. I just remembering a quote Daniel Seidel made when he was amongst his peers, amongst a bunch of scientists, and one scientist said, you know what, we should never even ask a question that can't be quantified. And one of the students of this scientist said, you know what, we should never even think a thought that can't be quantified. And this is Daniel Seidel, he's a psychiatrist, so he's bringing a point that maybe we have a limited view of what we think of as something real or something that, you know, is something that actually has validity, is things that can't be quantified. So one of the things that I really appreciate about coming to Pacifica is studying Jung. I'd like to read something that he wrote in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. So he's talking about, he was going to a lecture and he was thinking he had a patient. Okay. At about 2 o'clock, I must have just fallen asleep. I awoke with a start and had the feeling that someone had come into the room. I even had the impression that the door had been hastily opened. I instantly turned on the light, but there was nothing. Someone might have mistaken the door, I thought, and I looked into the corridor, but it was as still as death. Odd, I thought, someone did come into the room. Then I tried to recall exactly what had happened, and it occurred to me that I had been awakened by a feeling of dull pain, as though something had struck my forehead and then the back of my skull. The following day, I received a telegram saying that my patient had committed suicide. He had shot himself. Later, I learned that the bullet had come to rest in the back wall of the skull. So you read that, he's basically saying he picked up on what his patient was feeling. Not, you know, he picked up on the actual visceral sensation his patient had. So I find that so interesting, and yet it's like, well, how do you explain that, right? I mean, we all kind of get it, but it felt like that's something we sort of, or I felt, I should say, something I had to protect. Like I believed that, but how could I ever explain that to something? Well, here's how Jung explains it, and then I'll talk a little bit more about some other ideas around this. This experience was a genuine synchronistic phenomenon, such as is quite often observed in connection with an archetypal situation, in this case, death. By means of a relativization of time and space in the unconscious, it could well be that I had perceived something which in reality was taking place elsewhere. The collective unconscious is common to all. It is the foundation of what the ancients called the sympathy of all things. In this case, the unconscious had knowledge of my patient's condition. All that evening, in fact, I had felt curiously restive and nervous, very much in contrast to my usual mood. So that's a Jungian explanation for that. And it became, so I could buy that, right? And I was still looking for, well, what about science? Like, how do you quantify that? So I was going to talk about this later, but I'll just go a little to it. One of my research in quantum physics talked a lot about how they've been able to show that one atom can actually exist in 2 places at once. So I can't say, well, that's what it is, but I guess I just like to present that as a hypothesis that that is a concept that kind of blows our concept of space and time, where one atom could exist in 2 places. So I guess things like that, just holding that as a possibility for how some of these things might occur can be really helpful. I also became intrigued, especially in reading Jung, as far as the psychic connection between client and therapist. There was another instance in his book, in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, where he has a dream of someone, a girl, that has an unusual father complex. And then someone shows up to his office. He goes, this is the girl, but I don't see the father. Like, where's that? Well, he finds out that her grandfather was like a rabbi, and I think involved in very religious and spiritual activities. But he looks at her, he's like, well, she's just seems so modern. I don't get this at all. Well, then he has a dream that he was around a group of people, and he had an umbrella, and he handed it to her, but then he went on his knees, he says, as if she were a goddess. And he tells her the dream, and boom, he says, you know, she was, in essence, cured, because she was lacking the spiritual element in her life. So I bring that up because it's kind of like he had this intuition, and he shared it with his clients, and that actually was an intervention that seemed to work. So one of the things that I feel is really important as a result of what I've studied is for therapists to be able to tune into what images they have and what they're feeling in the room, and even their dreams. I read The Sense of Being Stared At by Rupert Sheldrake, and he has a lot of examples of patients that have had, or therapists that have had psychic dreams. And then he shares one of a guy who was looking at some architecture, a very specific style of house, a therapist. And the next week, his client came in and said, I had this wild dream about these architects and this kind of style of architecture. And actually, the client picked up on something the therapist had experienced. So I found that really interesting too, because it kind of shows that there really is a connection happening, perhaps, despite if we try to maintain, you know, anonymity. So I looked a little bit more about how intuition can show up. So one of the things that's often very common is an image. And we talk a lot about that at Pacifica, which, believe me, at first when people say, find an image, I really didn't click with that, you know, because I just felt more kind of visceral in what's happening in my body. But as I learned more, I realized that the image can be the unconscious's way of giving you some information without like telling you every detail. So you have the opportunity to play around with that image as an intuition. And the other way that it can show up sometimes is through the body. And Daniel Seidel and the neuroscience was really helpful in looking at that and looking at learning to listen to your own body, to pay attention to what signals that your body is giving you. I also, of course, wanted to explore what would somebody that isn't a proponent, that maybe there's this collective unconscious, or that's how we're picking up, you know, what might they say about intuition? And I came across Gavin DeBecker's work, and he works a lot with victims of crime and people that have just, you know, been through some stuff, or people like actually working with witnesses and whatnot. And one of the things that he really believes is that intuition is just, instead of going from A to Z, we have a biological capacity, or instead of going from A, B, C, D, E, we can just go from A to Z. So it's like built into us. It's like our unconscious is just, we just have it. And he used the word unconscious a lot, which I like that because that's what we do. He's actually, while he may not be a mystic, he's a proponent that the unconscious is at work. So I found that kind of heartening. One of the things that I looked at a little bit is what I consider to be resistance in the scientific community and amongst scientists. And I kind of explored that as, why would that be here? Why might that be the case? Why, you know, is it because it's so false? And I started to look at it a little bit more from a Jungian perspective, and it occurred to me that that resistance might be a kind of a complex, and something where this concept that, hey, one atom can exist in two places, that's kind of scary. Like, what do you do with that? I mean, really, had you go home and you just cook dinner? I mean, it's kind of a big concept. You know what I mean? So I thought, you know, that might be that it's a little scary to entertain the idea that, you know, someone has an impression or an intuition or an image, and that there turns out to be something valid to it. So I just sort of, it actually made me a little more compassionate, you know, because I realized that sometimes when people are really expressing a resistance towards that, there may be something really within them. So it taught me a little bit more patience of that, rather than like, why don't you believe this and all that stuff. So it was helpful to me. One thing I thought was really cool is also how intuition and imagination can begin to overlap. I saw a neat thing, it was actually on YouTube, of a scientist for NASA who was trying to have a design for a space vehicle to land. And this was all, you know, he's a scientist, I think he's an engineer. He couldn't figure it out. He spent months trying to figure it out. He couldn't figure how is this going to work. So one day he went to bed and said, you know what? Just take care of this unconscious. Like, I need you to figure this out. And all of a sudden an image came forward of like a space vehicle with robots that could come out and do the job for him.